Jack Carter was a long-haul trucker. He had been on the road for 20 years, driving through endless highways, quiet towns, and dark, lonely nights. He loved the freedom of his job, the open road, the hum of the engine, and the peace of being alone with his thoughts. But trucking wasn't always peaceful. Jack had heard stories from other drivers, stories about strange things on the road. Some were about accidents or hitchhikers who seemed to vanish into thin air. Others were darker, creatures in the woods, strange lights in the sky, or ghostly figures that appeared in the middle of nowhere. Jack didn't believe in any of it. To him, they were just tall tales to pass the time. But one fateful trip changed everything. It was late October, and the weather was turning cold. Jack had just finished a delivery in Kansas City when his dispatcher called. "I've got a job for you, Jack," the dispatcher said. "A shipment of machinery needs to be delivered to a small town in Montana. It's a long haul, 2 days, maybe 3. Jack rubbed his chin. Montana was a long drive, but the pay was good, and he wasn't one to turn down work. "I'll take it," he said. "Good," the dispatcher replied. "But listen, Jack, this route goes through some rough areas. Stick to the main roads, okay?" Jack chuckled. "Don't worry about me. I've been driving these highways for years." Jack loaded the cargo and hit the road. The first few hours were uneventful, just miles of highway stretching ahead. He turned on the radio, switching between country music and static as the stations faded in and out. By nightfall, the road grew quieter. The stars were bright in the sky, and the cold wind rattled against the cab. Jack kept driving, sipping coffee to stay awake. Around midnight, he saw the first sign that something was off. Up ahead, on the side of the road, was a car with its hazard lights blinking. Jack slowed down, pulling over to see if anyone needed help. As he approached, he noticed something strange. The car was empty. The driver's door was open, and the engine was still running, but there was no one inside. Jack frowned, stepping out of his truck. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing in the quiet night. No answer. He shined his flashlight around, checking the nearby ditch and bushes. Still nothing. It was as if the driver had simply vanished. Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine. He climbed back into his truck and drove off, glancing in his mirrors. The blinking hazard lights of the abandoned car faded into the distance. An hour later, Jack turned off the radio. The static was grating on his nerves. The silence of the road was better, or so he thought. As he drove, he thought he heard something, faint at first, like a whisper. He turned the radio back on, but the whispering continued, growing louder. It wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from his... "Breaker, breaker, this is Roadrunner," a deep voice crackled over the CB. "Anyone out there?" Jack grabbed the mic. "This is Iron Jack. What's up, Roadrunner?" There was a pause, then the voice came back, quieter now. "You're on Route 46, aren't you?" Jack glanced at the map on his dashboard. He was. "Yeah, why?" "Turn around," the voice said. "Get off that road, now." Jack frowned. "What are you talking about? I've got a delivery to make." The line went dead. Jack tried to respond, but there was no answer, just static. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, "Probably some joker messing with me." He kept driving. Around 2 a.m., the highway stretched into a narrow, winding road. The trees on either side were tall and dark, their branches reaching over the road like claws. Jack turned on his high beams, trying to cut through the shadows. That's when he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Jack slammed on the brakes, his truck screeching to a halt. The figure didn't move. It was a man, dressed in a tattered coat, his face obscured by shadow. Jack honked the horn. "Hey, get out of the road!" The man didn't respond. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed toward the woods. Jack felt a knot of unease in his stomach. He wasn't one to scare easily, but there was something wrong about this. He rolled down his window. "You need help?" The man turned his head slightly, and Jack saw his face, or what should have been his face. It was blank, featureless, like a mannequin. Jack's blood ran cold. He rolled up the window and floored the gas, swerving around the figure. In his rearview mirror, the man didn't move. He just stood there, pointing at the woods. By dawn, Jack was running low on fuel. He pulled into a small gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The windows were dusty, and the neon sign flickered weakly. As he filled up his tank, he went inside to grab a coffee. The clerk, a wiry old man with a scruffy beard, looked up from his newspaper. "Morning," Jack said. "Quiet out here." The clerk nodded. "Not many people come this way." Jack hesitated. "You ever see anything strange around here?" The clerk's expression darkened. "Strange how?" "Like people on the road, but not really people." The clerk stared at him for a moment, then shook his head. "You're on Route 46, aren't you?" Jack nodded. The clerk leaned in, his voice low. "That road's cursed. People disappear out there. Some say it's the land. Others say it's something older, something that doesn't want us here." Jack didn't respond. He grabbed his coffee, paid, and looked. As Jack drove deeper into Montana, the road became more isolated. The trees grew thicker, and the sky seemed darker, even in the middle of the day. The whispers started again, faint but constant. Jack turned up the radio to drown them out, but they only grew louder. He thought he saw shadows moving between the trees, keeping pace with his truck. He told himself it was just his imagination. He hadn't slept much, and the stress was getting to him. But then, the shadows began to take shape. Long, thin figures with glowing eyes, flitting between the trees. Ahead, Jack saw a sign. "Detour ahead, road closed." It directed him onto a narrow dirt road that cut through the forest. Jack didn't trust it. He checked his map, but the detour wasn't listed. Still, he had no choice. He turned onto the dirt road, the truck bouncing on the uneven ground. The road wound deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to press closer, their branches scraping against the sides of the truck. The whispers grew louder, almost mocking him. Then his engine sputtered. "No, no, no," Jack muttered, hitting the dashboard. The truck rolled to a stop. He tried the ignition, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Jack grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the cab. The air was cold and still. He opened the hood, shining the light inside. But nothing seemed wrong, yet the truck wouldn't start. That's when he heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from... Jack turned, his flashlight shaking in his hand. Something was moving between the trees, just beyond the beam of light. He caught glimpses of it, a hunched, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. The growl grew louder, and Jack backed toward his truck. "Stay back," he shouted, though he wasn't sure who or what he was. The creature stepped into the light. It was massive, with matted fur, long claws, and a face that was almost human but twisted and wrong. Its mouth stretched into a wide grin, filled with sharp teeth. Jack scrambled into the cab, slamming the door. The creature lunged, slamming against the side of the truck. Jack grabbed his CB mic. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Iron Jack. I need help, something's out here." The CB crackled, and a voice came through. It was the same deep voice from before. "I told you to turn around." The creature clawed at the windows, its growls shaking the cab. Jack turned the key, praying the engine would start. It roared to life. Jack floored the gas, the truck lurching forward. The creature chased him, its claws scraping against the trailer. Jack swerved onto the main road, the wheels skidding on the dirt. He didn't stop until he reached a rest area on the outskirts of a small town. Shaking, he climbed out and checked the trailer. Long claw marks ran down its side, the metal bent and torn. Jack never delivered the shipment. He called his dispatcher, made up a story about engine trouble, and left the truck at a local repair shop. Then he bought a bus ticket and went home. He never took Route 46 again. Years later, when he told the story to other truckers, they just nodded knowingly. "You're lucky," one of them said. "Most people don't make it back." Jack didn't feel lucky. He still heard the whispers sometimes, late at night, and he knew that whatever was out there in the woods wasn't done with him. Rick Grayson had been a trucker for 20 years. He loved the job, the open road, the freedom and the solitude. He didn't mind the long hours or the endless stretches of highway. For Rick, the truck was home, and the road was his life. But one trip, on a cold autumn night, changed everything. It made him question the things he had always thought were impossible. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Rick got the call from his dispatcher. "Rick, I've got a load for you," the dispatcher said. "It's urgent, though. Needs to get to Clearwater by morning." "Clearwater?" Rick asked, confused. "That's way off my usual." "I know," the dispatcher admitted, "but the pay is good, double the usual rate." Rick hesitated. Clearwater was in the middle of nowhere, a small town surrounded by dense woods and mountains. It wasn't the kind of place he usually delivered to, but double pay was hard to turn down. "All right," Rick said finally. "Send me the details." Rick picked up the cargo, a shipment of industrial supplies, and hit the road. The first few hours were uneventful. He drove through familiar highways, passing other truckers and the occasional rest stop. But as night fell, the GPS directed him onto an unfamiliar road. The sign read Route 17A. Rick frowned. He didn't remember ever taking this road before, and it wasn't listed on his usual maps. The GPS assured him it was the shortest way to Clearwater, so he turned onto the route. As he drove, the road grew narrower, and the trees on either side seemed to close in. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the hum of the engine was the only sound. After an hour, Rick began to feel uneasy. There were no other cars, no streetlights, not even a house in sight. The only thing ahead was the dark, winding road. Around midnight, Rick spotted something strange. Up ahead, on the side of the road, was a car with its hazard lights blinking. Rick slowed down and pulled over. The car was an old sedan, and its hood was open. A man stood next to it, waving his arms. Rick rolled down the window. "You need help?" he called. The man nodded. "Yeah, my car broke down. I don't have cell service out here. Can you give me a ride to the next town?" Rick hesitated. He wasn't supposed to pick up strangers, but the man looked genuinely desperate. "All right," Rick said. "Hop in." The man climbed into the cab. He was tall and thin, with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. "Thanks, man," the stranger said. "Name's Tom." Rick replied. "Where you headed?" "Clearwater," Tom said. Rick raised an eyebrow. "What are the odds?" At first, Tom was talkative, chatting about his life and the trip he had been on before his car broke down. But as they drove deeper into the woods, he grew quiet. Rick glanced at him. Tom was staring out the window, his face pale. "You all right?" Rick asked. Tom didn't respond. He just pointed ahead. Rick followed his gaze and felt his stomach drop. Up ahead, in the middle of the road, was a figure. It was a woman in a long white dress, standing completely still. Rick slowed the truck, honking the horn. "Hey, get out of the road." The woman didn't move. Rick stopped the truck and rolled down the window. "Ma'am, you need to move." Still, she didn't respond. Tom grabbed Rick's arm. "Don't get out," he said, his voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" Rick asked. Tom shook his head. "Just don't." Rick stayed in the cab, watching the woman. She stood perfectly still, her face hidden by her long hair. Then, without warning, she vanished. One moment she was there, and the next, she was gone. "What the hell?" Rick muttered. Tom's face was pale. "You should have turned back," he whispered. Rick frowned. "What are you talking about?" "This road," Tom said. "It's not normal. People talk about it, truckers, locals. They say it's cursed." Rick shook his head. "That's just stories." Tom didn't respond. He just stared out the window, his hands shaking. As they continued down the road, Rick began to notice movement in the trees. Shadows darted between the trunks, too fast to be animals. Tom saw them too. "They're watching us," he said. "Who?" Rick asked. Tom didn't answer. The shadows grew closer, and the whispering started. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves. But soon, it became voices, low guttural whispers that seemed to come from all around them. Rick gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He turned on the radio to drown out the whispers, but it was just static. Finally, they reached a small clearing. In the center was a cluster of old, run-down buildings. It looked like a town, but everything was abandoned. The windows were broken, and the wooden structures were rotting. "This must be Clearwater," Rick said, though he wasn't sure. Tom shook his head. "This isn't it." Rick parked the truck and stepped out. The air was cold, and the silence was oppressive. "Stay here," Rick told Tom. He walked toward, shining his flashlight inside. The room was empty, but the walls were covered in strange symbols. Suddenly, he heard a loud bang from the truck. Rick ran back to the truck. The cab door was open, and Tom was gone. "Tom!" Rick shouted, his voice echoing in the darkness. There was no response. Rick climbed into the cab and locked the doors. The whispering returned, louder now, and the truck began to shake. Something slammed against the side of the trailer, hard enough to leave a dent. Rick turned the key, and the engine roared to life. He floored the gas, tearing out of the clearing and back onto the road. The road seemed endless now, twisting and turning through the dense woods. Rick glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something moving behind him, dark shapes with glowing eyes. They were getting closer. Rick pushed the truck go, but the shapes didn't stop. They surrounded the truck, their whispers turning into screams. Couldn't take it anymore. The road opened up. The trees thinned, and he saw the lights of a town up ahead. The whispers stopped, and the dark shapes vanished. Rick pulled into Clearwater just as the sun was rising. He parked the truck and stumbled into a diner, his hands shaking. The waitress looked at him with concern. "You okay, hon?" Rick nodded weakly. "Just had a rough night." He asked her about Route 17A, and her face grew pale. "That road's been closed for years," she said. "There was an accident. A whole bus full of people went off the cliff. They say their spirits still haunt the road." Rick didn't respond. He finished his coffee, left the diner, and swore he'd never take an unfamiliar route again. Sam Tate was a long-haul trucker. He had driven across the country for over a decade, hauling everything from livestock to construction equipment. He liked his job, even if it was lonely. The long hours and empty highways gave him time to think. But there were moments, those dark nights when the road seemed endless, when his mind would wander to the stories he'd heard from other truckers. Ghosts, vanished travelers, strange creatures in the woods. Sam didn't believe in any of it, not until the night he took the midnight haul through Echo Pass. Outside of Reno, Nevada, Sam had just finished delivering a load of furniture and was looking forward to a good night's rest. His dispatcher, Mark, called just as he was about to check into a motel. "Sam, I've got an urgent job," Mark said. "A company needs a load of medical supplies delivered to a hospital in Carson Valley by tomorrow morning." Sam sighed. "Mark, I've been driving all day. Can't you give it to someone else?" "Double pay," Mark said quickly, "and a bonus if you get it there by sunrise." Sam thought about it. He could use the money. The holidays were coming, and his kids' wish lists weren't getting any shorter. "All right," he said. "Send me the details." The load was waiting for him at a warehouse not far from the truck stop. By 10 p.m., Sam was back on the road heading toward Carson Valley. His GPS directed him onto a route he'd never taken before, Highway 56 through Echo Pass. Echo Pass was a lonely stretch of road winding through the mountains. Sam had never heard of it before, and that made him uneasy. Most truckers stuck to the main highways, but the GPS insisted this was the fastest route. The road was narrow and winding, cutting through dense pine forests. The trees loomed tall on either side, their branches forming a dark canopy overhead. The headlights of Sam's truck barely seemed to cut through the gloom. The night was eerily quiet. No other cars, no animals, not even the sound of wind through the trees. Just the low hum of his engine and the crunch of gravel under his tires. Sam turned on the radio to break the silence, but it was all static. He switched it off and tried to focus on the road. Around midnight, Sam saw something up ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. He slowed the truck, squinting through the windshield. It was a man, waving his arms. Sam pulled over and rolled down the window. "You all right, buddy?" The man looked disheveled, his clothes torn and his face pale. "Please," he said, his voice shaky. "My car broke down a few miles back. Can you give me a ride to the nearest town?" Sam hesitated. He wasn't supposed to pick up strangers, but the man looked desperate. "All right," he said. "Climb in." The man climbed into the passenger seat, his hands trembling. "Thanks," he said. "Name's Bill." Sam replied. "Where you headed?" "Anywhere but here," Bill muttered, glancing nervously out the window. Sam frowned. "What do you mean?" Bill didn't answer. He just shook his head. As they drove, Sam tried to make conversation, but Bill was quiet, staring out the window with a haunted look in his eyes. Finally, after several minutes of silence, Bill spoke. "You shouldn't be on this road," he said. Sam glanced at him. "What are you talking about?" "This place," Bill said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something wrong with it." Sam chuckled nervously. "You mean the road?" "Yeah, it's pretty rough." Bill shook his head. Not the road. The things that live here. Sam frowned. What? You'll see, Bill said, his voice trembling. An hour later, as they climbed higher into the mountains, Sam began to notice strange shapes in the trees. At first, he thought it was just the shadows from his headlights playing tricks on him. But then he saw them move. Dark figures, flitting between the trees, always just out of sight. Sam gripped the wheel tighter, his heart pounding. You see them, don't you? Bill asked quietly. Sam nodded. What are they? Bill didn't answer. The figures grew bolder, darting closer to the road. Sam caught glimpses of glowing eyes and twisted shapes that didn't look human or animal. As they rounded a bend, Sam slammed on the brakes. Up ahead, the road ended abruptly. A wooden bridge that had once spanned a deep ravine was broken, its planks shattered and hanging by a thread. Damn it, Sam muttered. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the truck to take a closer look. The ravine was deep, and the broken bridge swayed slightly in the wind. Sam shined his flashlight around, hoping to find another way across. That's when the shadows were closer now, standing at the edge of the trees, dozens of them, their glowing eyes fixed on him. Get back in the truck, Bill yelled. Sam didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled back into the cab and slammed the door shut. The shadows moved closer, their whispers filling the air. Bill pointed to a narrow dirt path that veered off the main road. Take that. It'll lead us around the ravine. Sam hesitated. The path looked barely wide enough for his truck, but the shadows were closing in, and he didn't have much choice. He turned the wheel and guided the truck onto the dirt path. The ride was rough, the truck bouncing and groaning as it navigated the uneven terrain. The shadows followed, keeping pace with the truck, their whispers growing louder. What do they want? Sam asked. They want us, Bill said. They feed on fear. After what felt like hours, the path led them to a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a small, abandoned town. The buildings were old and crumbling, their windows shattered. Rusted cars sat in the streets, their tires flat. Sam parked the truck and turned to Bill. What is this place? Bill shook his head. I don't know, but we're not. Truck, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the silence was deafening. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the town. Sam spun around, his flashlight sweeping across the buildings. He saw movement, a shadow darting between the ruins. The whispers returned, louder than ever. The shadows poured out of the buildings, their glowing eyes fixed on Sam and Bill. Sam climbed back into the truck, slamming the door shut. What do we do? He asked. Bill was pale, his hands trembling. We have to get out of here. Sam started the engine, but it sputtered and died. He tried again, but the truck wouldn't start. The shadows were closing in, their whispers turning into screams. Desperate, Sam grabbed a flare gun from the glove compartment. He fired it into the air, the bright light illuminating the clearing. The shadows recoiled, hissing and retreating into the darkness. Go, Bill shouted. Sam and Bill ran, leaving the truck behind. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the clearing. The shadows didn't follow. Hours later, as the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, Sam and Bill stumbled onto a main highway. A passing car picked them up and took them to the nearest town. Sam told his story to the police, but they didn't believe him. When they returned to the abandoned town, the truck was gone, and there was no sign of the shadows. Sam quit trucking after that. He couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still out there, waiting. Joe Harper was a seasoned trucker. He had been on the road for 25 years, hauling freight from coast to coast. Joe was the kind of guy who didn't scare easily. He had seen it all. Snowstorms that nearly buried his rig, highway accidents that made him thank his lucky stars, and the kind of people you didn't want to meet twice. But nothing, not in all his years of trucking, had prepared him for what he would face on Dead Man's Route. It was supposed to be an easy trip, just a simple overnight haul of canned goods to a distribution center 2 states over. But by the time the sun rose the next morning, Joe's life would never be the same. The night started like any other. Joe picked up his load at a warehouse in Kansas City and set out for Wichita. The route was straightforward: stick to the interstate, make good time, and maybe even catch a few hours of sleep in a motel before unloading. But about an hour into his drive, his dispatcher called. "Joe," said the voice on the other end, "we've got a problem. There's a major accident on the interstate. It's backed up for miles. You're gonna have to take a detour." Joe frowned. He didn't like detours. They often meant narrow roads, poor lighting, and unreliable GPS directions. "What's the alternate route?" he asked. "Take County Road 39, the dispatcher said. "It'll get Joe to the main highway past the jam." Joe punched the route into his GPS. A red line snaked through the map, taking him off the interstate and onto a lonely 2-lane road. "All right," he said reluctantly. "I'll take it." County Road 39 was quiet, too quiet. The trees on either side of the road loomed tall and dark, their branches forming a tunnel that blocked out the moonlight. Joe's headlights cut through the darkness, but even they didn't seem to reach far enough. He drove for miles without seeing another car. The only sounds were the low hum of his engine and the occasional creak of his trailer. Joe turned on the radio, hoping for some music to break the silence, but all he got was static. "Figures," he muttered, switching it off. Around midnight, Joe spotted something up ahead. At first he thought it was an animal, a deer, or maybe a stray dog, but as he got closer, he realized it was a man standing on the side of the road, waving his arms. Joe slowed down and rolled down the window. The man looked young, maybe in his late 20s. He was wearing jeans and a tattered hoodie, and his face was pale. "You all right, buddy?" Joe called out. "Please," the man said, his voice shaky. "My car broke down a few miles back. Can you give me a ride to the next town?" Joe hesitated. He had a rule, no picking up hitchhikers. But something about the man's desperate expression made him reconsider. "All right," he said. "Hop in." The man climbed into the cab and buckled his seatbelt. "Thanks," he said, his voice still trembling. "I'm Kyle." "Joe," Joe replied. "Where are you headed?" "Anywhere but here," Kyle said, his eyes darting nervously out the window. For the first few minutes, they rode in silence. Joe kept his eyes on the road, but he couldn't help glancing at Kyle. The kid looked spooked, like he'd seen a ghost. "You all right?" Joe asked. Kyle shook his head. "You shouldn't be on this road," he said. Joe raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "This road," Kyle said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's cursed," Joe chuckled. "Cursed? Come on, kid. You been watching too many horror movies?" Kyle didn't laugh. "I'm serious," he said. "People go missing out here. Truckers, travelers, whole families. They just disappear." Joe frowned. He had heard his share of urban legends from other truckers, but he had never put much stock in them. "What happens to them?" he asked. Kyle didn't answer. He just stared out the window, his hands gripping the seatbelt like a lifeline. About an hour later, Joe saw something strange. Up ahead, in the middle of the road, was a large tree branch. It was too big to drive over, so Joe slowed to a stop. "Stay here," he told Kyle as he grabbed a flashlight and climbed out of the cab. The night air was cold, and the forest was eerily silent. Joe shined his flashlight on the branch. It looked fresh, like it had fallen recently, but there was no storm, no wind, nothing that could have knocked it down. Joe was about to move the branch when he heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the trees. He froze, shining his flashlight into the woods. The beam caught a pair of glowing eyes, just for a moment, before they disappeared into the darkness. Joe's heart pounded. He hurried back to the truck, climbed in, and locked the door. "What's wrong?" Kyle asked, his voice trembling. "Nothing," Joe lied, starting the engine. "Let's keep moving." As they drove deeper into the forest, the road seemed to narrow. The trees on either side pressed closer, their branches scraping against the sides of the trailer like claws. Kyle grew increasingly anxious, his eyes darting around the cab. "They're watching us," he said. "Who?" Joe asked. Kyle didn't answer. Joe kept his eyes on the road, but he began to notice movement in the trees. Shadows darted between the trunks, too fast to be animals. "Must be deer," Joe muttered, trying to convince himself. But then one of the shadows stepped onto the road. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs and eyes that glowed red in the headlight. Joe slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop, and the shadow disappeared. "What the hell was that?" Joe asked, his voice shaking. Kyle didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead, his face pale. Eventually, the road led them to a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a cluster of old, abandoned buildings. The windows were shattered, and the walls were covered in graffiti. Rusted cars sat in overgrown lots, their tires flat. This must be the next town," Joe said, though he didn't believe it. Kyle shook his head. "This isn't on any map." Joe parked the truck and stepped out. The air was heavy and the silence was deafening. "Stay here," he told Kyle. As he approached one of the buildings, he noticed something strange. The walls were covered in symbols, circles, triangles, and lines that didn't make any sense. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the clearing. Joe spun around and saw that the truck's headlights had gone out. "Kyle?" Joe called out, his voice echoing. There was no response. Joe ran back to the truck, but Kyle was gone. The passenger door was wide open, and the cab was empty. "Kyle!" Joe shouted. The shadows emerged from the trees, their glowing eyes fixed on Joe. They moved closer, their whispers filling the air. Joe climbed into the cab and tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. "Come on," he muttered, turning the key again and again. The shadows surrounded the truck, their whispers growing louder. Joe grabbed his flashlight and climbed into the sleeper cab, shutting the door behind him. He pressed his back against the wall, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The whispers turned into screams, and the truck began to shake. Joe closed his eyes, praying for it to stop. When Joe opened his eyes, the sun was rising. The shadows were gone, and the forest was quiet. The truck started on the first try, and Joe didn't look back as he drove away. When he reached the distribution center in Wichita, the workers were surprised to see him. "You came through Dead Man's Route?" one of them asked. Joe nodded. "Yeah, why?" The man shook his head. "You're lucky to be alive. Most people who take that road don't make it." Joe didn't respond. He finished his delivery, climbed back into his truck, and swore he'd never take another detour again.